Hi, this is Laurie Itkin. You can find me at theoptionslady.com. I'm a certified divorce financial analyst who practices throughout California, also known as a CDFA. So a common issue I find when I'm working on a California divorce is that I will be working for a client, and let's say his name is Jim, and Jim says, "Hey Laurie, we bought a house during marriage and I put down a $30,000 down payment from my bank account that I had before marriage. And I understand, Laurie, that if we sell the property or there's a buyout, I'm entitled to a separate property reimbursement. And if I made a down payment of $30,000 from a separate property bank account that I had before marriage, then I should be entitled to reimbursement for that $30,000. Okay. Maybe Jim, let me show you. So we go through Jim's timeline, and here's his deal. He had $100,000 in his bank account before the date of marriage. He understands that when he receives a paycheck or any compensation and it's deposited into that account, he's now commingled the account with community property income, because the day you get married, the income that you or your spouse earns is community income, unless of course you have a prenup or a postnuptial agreement. So he had $100,000 in the bank account before the date of marriage. He acknowledges that between salary and bonuses, $28,000 was deposited in the account. He also informs me that, hey, he paid a lot of bills from that account. There were Visa bills, Amex bills, medical bills, and the presumption is that any expenses during the marriage are going to be community expenses, right? So credit cards, who doesn't matter who made the charge on the credit card or whose surgery it was, these are community expenses. Again, unless you have a premarital agreement or a prenuptial agreement. So under his math, he's like, hey, Laurie, $28,000 was deposited in the account, community income, and the expenses paid towards the community expenses was $31,000. So if I withdraw $30,000 for a down payment on a property, since the expenses that were community were more than the community property income, well then of course I use separate property for the down payment, and I should get my $30,000 separate property reimbursement. Not so fast, Jim. All right, Jim isn't going to like it, what I'm about to show him, but in California, we have tracing guidelines. There are things we have to do for you to prove it's your separate property that went into this little house here. So let me show you how that works. So I go up here and I have date of marriage. He had $100,000 in his bank account. Then his paycheck, first paycheck after marriage comes in. So the account balance goes from $100,000 to $104,000. But his separate property balance is still $100,000 because that $4,000 is now community property. So with that paycheck, he has now commingled this account. It is no longer purely separate property. It is mixed, separate, and community property. So then we have a $3,000 Visa bill. And so the 104 goes down to 101. And since this was a Visa bill incurred during the marriage, we presume it's community expenses, and therefore the community needs to pay that bill. So the community balance goes from $4,000 to $1,000, and Jim still has his $100,000 separate property balance. Now the $15,000 Amex bill comes in, and guess what? There's only $1,000 of community property, so that We take the $1,000 out of the community property. Now there's no community property funds in here, but Jim had to cover the $14,000 out of the account. So the account, you can understand, goes from 101 to 86 because that's a $15,000 decrease, but his separate property balance also decreases. Okay? Now, good news, he gets another paycheck. Well, not really good news for him, good news for the account. And so that $4,000 paycheck doesn't go to reimburse him because it's community income. It goes to the community property balance. So now we're positive $4,000 and his separate property is still at $86,000. Now we have a $13,000 medical bill. Uh-oh, there's only $4,000 in the community property balance to pay. So of that $13,000 medical bill, the $4,000 comes out of the community property to zero, and Jim now has to subsidize the other $9,000. Now it doesn't matter who had the procedure, him, her, whatever, because it's a community bill. So now we've exhausted the community again, and so Jim has to cover the remainder. So there's $77,000 in the account now, and it's all his separate property. Now he gets a $20,000 bonus, which is community property income. And so the community property balance gets credited with $20,000. His $77,000 does not change. Now, here's where we are here. So that is the balance on March 19th, 2020. I made up these dates. I also itemized these wrong. That should be a 7. So now here comes the $30,000 down payment. Again, this is in Jim's name. The name on the account has not changed. It's still Jim's account. And the $97,000, now he takes out $30,000 for the down payment. The account's now down to $67,000. And as we showed earlier, he assumes that $30,000 is his separate property. But let's really look here. He is wrong because there was still a $20,000 community property balance. And when you are purchasing real estate during marriage, unless you, again, go through hoops to state that it's not community property, the presumption is it's community property, well then the $20,000 is used up first, and then the other $10,000 comes from his separate property. So the $20,000 goes to zero, and his $77,000 goes to $67,000. So Jim cannot claim a $30,000 separate property reimbursement. He can only claim a $10,000 separate property reimbursement for the down payment because $20,000 of it was community property. All right. That's the deal, folks. I know it's not, Jim's not happy with this result, but this is how we trace separate property. I do a lot of separate property tracing and retirement accounts, and this is when I get the question about a bank account. People, it's astounding. People say to me, hey, I came into this marriage with, $200,000 or $100,000 or whatever, and now they're asking for reimbursement, but they have to go through this exercise. So if you have any questions about this, you can reach out to me at theoptionslady.com. Thanks for watching.